Welcome to the Being in Medicine show. I'm Corey Anderson.
And I'm Jeff Mars.
Together, we aim to revolutionize the healthcare experience for patients, clinicians, and all team members by unlocking the transformative power of human potential.
Each week, we explore with you and our guests how embracing our authentic selves and choosing who we are being can affect the nature of healing, leading to profound transformations in our lives and in the lives of those around us.
Join us today on a journey through self-discovery and empowerment as we unlock the human potential within each of us. Welcome, everyone, to Being in Medicine, where we explore the profound connection between mind, body, and spirit in the journey of true healing. Today's conversation focuses on mental well-being and the road to peace. We are honored to welcome Dr. Bill Pettit, a seasoned psychiatrist who has shared the three principles understanding for over 40 years, integrating it deeply into his medical practice. Mentored personally by Sydney Banks for more than 2 decades, Bill's approach simplifies mental health to one cause and one cure: chronic mental stress, and the healing power of love and understanding. A former Navy pilot surgeon and academic professor, Bill Pettit brings a rare blend of clinical rigor, lived experience, and spiritual insight. He's seen thousands of patients once labeled with mental illness rediscover their innate well-being, not through more labels or diagnoses, but through understanding. Dr. Pettit has retired from psychiatry, but not from service, sharing his message with warmth, clarity, and unwavering hope. Well, we welcome Dr. Pettit to Being in Medicine, and we're so glad you're here with us. Welcome.
Well, it's nice to be here. I have a couple of corrections, if I can.
Yeah, please do.
I was not I did 2 years of general surgery, but then during Vietnam, I stopped after that and was spent 3 years as a Navy flight surgeon, which is a misnomer. You're just a doctor for a squadron of Navy pilots. And I came out of retirement about 8-9 months ago, and I do a clinic every Monday via telehealth.
Oh, wonderful.
From Family Medicine and Family Medicine of Michigan clinic. I do a medication-assisted clinic for people that are addicted to opioids and on Suboxone.
Wow.
Replacement. But, you know, what's really interesting is we often, at the end of the session, we read a 6 or 7 page chapter from Sydney Banks' The Missing Link.
Yeah.
And what's happening with these people, you can imagine. Is this okay if I just give a brief thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Anybody who's gotten addicted to to opioids was innocently using the gift of thought in a way that was activating what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal distress response, right?
Yeah.
And so it is not unusual for them to have at least 3 stress-related physical illnesses: bruxism, migraine headaches, GERD, irritable bowel syndrome, asthma, allergies, you name it. And what's been fascinating as the people that have been willing to engage in understanding the spiritual nature and the connection between their spiritual nature and their psychological and physical nature and their being, if you will.
Yeah.
One lady said last week on Monday, she said, I said, "You look different." And she said, "I am different." I said, what is it? She said, because of what I'm seeing in exploring this videos and the book with Mr. Banks, I'm living 30% more of the time of my waking hours in my life and 30% less in my thinking.
Wow.
And that's the key, because I mean, I know that's what you talk about, is being present.
Yes.
My late wife who died in 2000 after 31 years of marriage, she said to me in 1984, she said, "This principles stuff is really quite simple." I said, What do you mean, honey? It's simple. Because I was not making it simple.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure it out with my analytical thinking.
Sure.
And she said, well, what I see is that every human being on earth now, and anybody who's ever walked the earth, their entire time on earth, they're one of two places. They're either in their life or they're in their thoughts.
Oh, wow.
And you can only be one of two places.
That's brilliant.
And it is brilliant. It's simple but profound.
Yeah.
I remember watching some children. I spoke in the Czech Republic one time at a program, and I saw some children playing, and I couldn't understand, obviously, a word they were saying, but as they ran and played, yes, they were thinking, but they were not in their thoughts.
Right.
They were in their life.
They were in their lives. They were
And
living.
I saw another older couple, white-haired couple, walking hand in hand, looking at each other lovingly, and probably in their late 70s or early 80s. And I thought, they too are not in their thoughts.
Yeah.
They're present in their life.
Yeah. That's great.
It's that simple.
It is that simple. That's a brilliant. It's that simple. But help our listeners understand, what are the three principles?
Well, first of all, they're a metaphor.
Yeah.
Mr. Sidney Banks was a very simple man. He was not a searcher. He was, you can look him up on his YouTube channel, sydneybanks.org. He died in 2009. In 1973, now 52 years ago, he was a welder in a pulp mill on Vancouver Island. He was 43 years old. He was married and had two children. And all he wanted to do was to stop bickering with his wife.
Yeah.
I mean, a very uncommon thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone can relate.
That's all he wanted to do. He wasn't searching for anything. And he went to a 3-day program from a psychiatrist that had come out from New York to Vancouver. And he and his wife went to it, and they walked out of it on the second day because they had them yelling at each other. This was 1973, right?
Yeah.
And telling how they really felt about things and things that they hadn't mentioned. And
Sure.
They walked out with another young couple the second day. And Sid said to this young psychologist, he said, I realized, I'm glad we walked out, but I have realized that I have a problem. I'm insecure.
Mm.
And this psychologist said to him something really interesting. He said, Sid, I've been with you for 2 days. That's a bunch of rubbish. He said, that's a bunch of rubbish. He said, you're not insecure. You just think you are.
Mm. Yes.
Now, how else can we create insecurity other than via our use of the divine gift of thought?
Yeah.
That's the only way.
Right.
Well, Sid felt like, he said, I felt like he had been hit by a Mack truck.
Yeah.
And this is on a set of videos. He finally allowed himself to be recorded because he didn't, for 27 years, he said, I don't want followers. I'll talk to doctors. I'll talk to educators. He consulted to John Hopkins. He consulted to the U.S. Navy, consulted to a medical school for 10 years. But at that moment, he said to the man, he said, do you realize what you just said? And this man said, I don't make idle. Of course I do. I never make idle chatter. But Sid said he didn't, because I knew him 25 years later and he was still anxious and depressed.
Yeah.
And for Sid had been born to a teenage girl in Scotland, illegitimate, adopted to a very poor family. And on one of his videotapes called the Long Beach Lectures, where he finally agreed in the year 2000 to be publicly viewed, 27 years after his experience, he said in there, he said, when I realized it was all thought, the horror of my childhood disappeared. Now, horror is a pretty strong word, right?
Yeah, it sure is.
Worse than difficulties or
Yeah.
No. He said the horror of my childhood disappeared in that instant, and I felt nothing but love for even those who had harmed me.
Wow. That's beautiful.
And he was awake for 3 days and 3 nights. So quietly, he said, I'd lie down with my wife until she fell asleep. And then I would sit, and I felt awe and wonder and gratitude for all that I had in my life. I know that both you and Jeff talk about gratitude and the power of gratitude.
Yeah.
And he said on the third day they took the ferry over from Vancouver Island over to Salt Spring Island where his mother-in-law lived. And his mother-in-law and wife were in the kitchen. Is this okay? I can bring it to the next 2 or 3 minutes.
No, we're listening. We're
Okay.
learning.
So his mother-in-law, who at the time they later became dearest friends, and she, on her deathbed, she said, "Please have Sid be here." And she became a teacher of his. And but at this time they basically hated each other's guts. And not that that's the only time ever that a mother-in-law and a son-in-law have had that experience. But so she was in the kitchen with his wife, and Sid was listening to them. And this was the third day. He was sitting quietly reading the newspaper, and he heard them, and he saw that they did not realize what they were creating with their thinking.
Yeah.
That they were creating their experience from the inside, and he got tickled and he started to giggle. And of course, then he tried to suppress his giggle, which we know that never works. And he started giggling more. And the next thing he looks up, he talks about this on the Long Beach lectures. It's really worthwhile listening to, because he also has the third one. He describes the experience and
Sure.
It makes it less foreign. So his wife, he said he looks up and here his mother-in-law is marching in and standing over him, and his wife is right behind her. And his mother-in-law is saying, "Well, Mr. Banks, want to tell us what's so funny?" and Sid says, I knew I was in trouble. I had 2 women against me, he said.
Yeah.
With his Scottish accent, Scottish Canadian accent. I had 2 women against me, he said.
Yeah.
And he stood up and he said, I was going to try to explain what had been happening for me over the last 3 days.
Yeah.
And I have the quote here. He said, "There's no such thing as insecurity. It's only thought. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I stood up and suddenly it was like I was being sucked down a tunnel. There was a buzzing sound and I was enveloped in a white light. And it was then that I realized the true meaning of God, and I started to cry."
Wow.
And he said to his wife and mother-in-law, he said, "I've conquered this world.
Yeah.
I've seen what people call God is. I've seen what life is. And I've seen how the two are connected. I didn't have a near-death experience. I had the death experience," he said. There's nothing but beauty. We're loved unconditionally. We see our own innocence, that we always did what we saw we could do given our level of understanding. He said to his wife, "Do you know what this means?" Well, you can imagine if your spouse, who's going back to the pulp mill as a welder, where he's been for 14 years on Monday after a week holiday,
Yeah.
says this. And she said the words, I never met Barbara, but I've heard through people that she said the words were terrifying. They were frightening, but I'd never seen a person's eyes so clear, or seen not only him, but anybody seen so peaceful.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to listen with an open mind. And here's what Sid said at that moment in 1973, August of 1973. He said, well, number one, he said, I will be writing books.
Yeah.
He had a 9th grade education. He wrote 10 books, 6 of which published, 4 of he left partially manuscripts. Six published books. Number 2, psychiatrists and psychologists are going to seek me out from all over the world, and other healers.
Yeah.
I know his son, David Banks. David said they would get away off the island for a weekend. They would come back and there would be people on tents. 10 months later, when he left his job, there would be, and they would be from Tibet and all over the world. And he had no idea how they
found him.
And so number 2, psychologists, psychiatrists, and healers, me being one of them, would seek me out and ask me to teach them what I've seen.
Right.
He said to his wife, number 3, he said, you and I are going to be traveling.
Yeah.
He said, because I'm going to be asked to speak. You can imagine this, right?
Yes.
I'm going to be asked to speak at colleges and universities, first here in Canada, eventually in the United States, and then eventually in Europe.
Yeah.
He was twice nominated for the Sir John Templeton International Spirituality Prize.
Wow. What an amazing story. And you were able to meet him and spend time and train with him.
26 years he was my
Yeah.
mentor. I met a man named Dr. George Pransky, and I was the national program director for a program called LifeSpring Incorporated.
Yeah.
It was like EST. Are you familiar with EST and Landmark?
Yeah. Landmark.
Well, Werner Erhard and John Hanley had been together with a thing called Life Dynamics,
Sure.
working for a man named Alexander Everett, and they had gotten shut down. They got accused of practicing medicine without a license.
Sure. Yeah.
Because they would say things like in their advertisement, do you have headaches? Do you have low back pain?
Yeah.
We can help you.
Right.
And so Werner Erhard, as part of the dissolution, Werner Erhard founded EST and John Hanley founded LifeSpring.
Yeah.
And I was the national program director for LifeSpring for 3 years after I left the Navy, after being the chief of psychiatry at the nuclear submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. And so I heard about this psychologist who people were coming who had been unable to be helped by anyone, and more often than not, Dr. Pransky they were fine after they saw him. And it was through him that I then, on April Fool's Day, 1983, sat with the 3-day Friday evening, Saturday, and Sunday with Sydney Banks, and that started a 26 years of being coached by him, I guess you would call it, or mentored by him.
Yeah, and that's where you discovered the 3 principles.
Yeah, and what he told me, Corey, he said, people think I made these principles up. He said, I didn't.
Yeah.
I had this experience of the divine, and I didn't know how to talk about it to people. How was I gonna?
Right.
And these were gifted to me as a metaphor.
Yeah.
For the nature and the attributes of what people call God.
Yeah.
And so the nature was pure love, and the attributes were intelligent mind, conscious, awareness, consciousness, and creative. And if you look around the universe, if you watch the animals, if you watch, you're right, the squirrels hide the nuts, the whales go down and have their babies and come back with a different song. The birds go 2,000 miles south and they come back to the same nest. Why would we not think that we were the exception, that we had been also gifted with a guidance system? The only difference being, as human beings, that we can override it with our personal thinking.
Yeah.
Which the animals and the plants can't do. So that's what I've been doing. And I have, one of the courses I have is called Witnessing Miracles. And I don't know, 8 days is a long time. I've only got a few participants, but I'm doing it so that even if 50 years after I'm gone, it's going to be recorded professionally.
Yeah.
Because eventually this is going to be in every medical school, every psychology, every psychiatry, I think every seminary.
Yeah.
Helping professions place, because I've seen people come out of schizophrenia. The one man had been 47 years in the state hospital.
Yeah.
I've had people come out of full-blown manic episodes right in front of me.
Right.
Most people don't. Most people, it's incremental. But because I know that the perfect mental well-being is spiritual, we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Sure.
That's what I speak to. And sometimes that aspect hears.
Yeah.
And healing is instantaneous.
Yeah. So let's talk about the healing. Let's talk about that.
Sure.
I've listened to you speak before, and we've had many conversations or a couple of conversations about this. What some of the real stories around healing people in your practice, through the 3 principles, really, really real stories of healing through this. Share a couple of those.
I'm getting ready to do this 8-day program because I've been the last 42 years, I've been in 9 different settings.
Yeah.
I'm starting to accumulate each one. What are the 4 or 5 stories from each place that I want to tell? Because I'm only going to have 32 hours over 8 days, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, where to start? The most dramatic one, I suppose, was one of the first ones. Well, the first one was actually personal. I think I might have shared this with you. My father and I loved each other, but we couldn't even watch a sporting event without a 50% chance of one of us stalking out of the room.
Wow.
Because we didn't understand separate realities.
Right.
We didn't understand that we were into right and wrong, right?
Yeah.
And after I met Sid in 1983 and I put in my resignation within 6 weeks, and then I spent 40 hours with George watching him do a new way of therapy, which was totally a different paradigm. And I headed to Coral Gables, Florida Sid was actually mentoring. This is 1983. He was mentoring 3 PhD psychologists.
Wow.
In Coral Gables, Florida. and he said, if you go there and go with them for 10 months to a year, while I'm mentoring them, I can mentor you. And so we stopped off at my hometown in Galesburg, Illinois, which is 190 miles southwest of Chicago, town of about 40,000. And when I saw my father, I saw him for the first time through eyes of unconditional love.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it had happened, Jeff. I didn't know it had happened. And I saw him and my heart melted and I felt so much love and gratitude and appreciation for him. And of course he's a human being, but he's done the best, and he must have felt it. We never even spoke about it because he told me more stories in the next 3 days than he had told me in 41 years. My father. So that was whenever I go to tell the story, I think that was for me as big as the what happened within a few weeks. I got a job at a 700 bed. Still at the 1983, they had 700 patients, 350 autism and developmentally disabled, 350 acute and chronic psychiatric patients. It's where a lot of the Thorazine research in the 50s took place in Galesburg at this huge state mental hospital. And I was the only psychiatrist there. There was a psychiatrist in the front office. Those 700 patients were being taken care of by family physicians who had done psychopharmacology courses.
Sure.
And psychologists and nurses and mental health professionals.
Yeah.
And I told this psychologist that these were all healthy people. They just didn't realize it. And he kept telling me that I was full of poop, right? Yeah. And only he was more graphic than that. And yet he kept wanting to have lunch with me, even though he said I was full of poop. And his panic disorder of 25 years and severe anxiety, after about 6 weeks of lunch, he said it disappeared. I said, where did it go? He said, I don't know. I don't have it anymore. I've got the lead role in my theater. I've never been able to because I've always had panic attacks. Yeah. Well, he invites me to do this group with chronic schizophrenic men on this unit. And I think I've told you this story. It was 2.5 sessions on a Wednesday afternoon when what happened. And do I wish I had been surreptitiously being filmed by somebody? Yes, I do. Yes. But I wasn't that I know of. And there was a man over here to the left, and he had his chair kind of askew from the group. Yes. He was talking to his auditory hallucinations quietly. And not to where he was disruptive, so I never said anything. So halfway through the third Wednesday, this man started laughing. And I don't mean giggling. I mean, his whole body shook. And I've had this experience once with my wife where my late wife, this happened. And I don't know if you've ever had that happen where it's contagious. It's more contagious than COVID, right?
Right.
You're holding your stomach, your eyes are watering, you're shaking, you're laughing, and you don't have no idea why you're laughing.
Yeah.
And you're begging the person to just stop it. And I said, what's his name? And he says, it's Herb. I said, Herb, stop it. Just stop it. And I didn't have a timer on it, but I think it was 7 to 10 minutes.
Wow.
And he stopped, and it was like an earthquake. Then he'd have an aftershock, which he explained later. He was having insights.
Yeah.
And he started laughing again and holding his stomach. And finally he stopped. And I waited till I got my breath and wiped my eyes. And then I looked over and he'd wiped his eyes and he was breathing normal. I said to the psychologist, I said, what's his name? And he said, Herb. I said, how long has he been here? He said, he's been here 47 years since he was 20.
Wow.
And I said, Herb, would you be willing to tell us what was so funny? And Herb picked up his chair. He put it clearly into the group. He looked across from me, just like I'm looking at the two of you. And he said, Doctor, while you were talking, I don't know whether he said suddenly, but I suddenly realized that I've been making myself crazy for 47 years with my own thinking.
Oh, man.
And I don't have to do it anymore.
Wow.
I was shaken. I really was, Jeff. I was shaken. As a physician and as a psychiatrist, I wanted to help people, but I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah.
Nobody ever taught me that this was possible. And I didn't tell you, but within 30 minutes, the day in April Fool's Day, 1983, just 6 months earlier, when I listened to Sid Banks, I had been going in and out of clinical depression for 20 years. I'd never education or my work, and I'd never been hospitalized. And I'm on medicines a couple of times. They didn't do much good, but I would sometimes almost get him. I think I went through medical school on about 2.5 cylinders.
Wow.
And it was hard as a result.
Yeah.
And my buddies, after I said, I'd love to go back to medical school again. They said, you're crazy. I said, no, but I've got 8 cylinders now. It would be really fun. And
Right.
as a result, I've become a lifelong learner, And so within 30 minutes of listening to Mr. Banks, I saw that my depression was not my genes. It wasn't my job. It wasn't my wife, my kids. It was me doing this metaphorically with my thinking. Worry, guilt, resentment, upset, overanalyzing, unresolved grief, drivenness, you name it.
Just hitting yourself over and over in the head with it.
And then wondering why I had another one of those damn right-sided headaches at the end of the day.
Right.
Metaphorically, why I was depressed. I'm down again. And so Sid used to say, he said, Bill, sometimes people are going to hear and see, they're going to realize from within their consciousness what you're pointing to. And occasionally, and that's my word, he said, sometimes they're not only going to see what you're pointing to, they're going to see beyond what you're pointing to, and they're going to see something that you don't see. Yeah. I don't think I would have been offended if it would have been you or either the two of you. But to have a man who'd been in a state hospital for 47 years say, and he meant it, I don't have to do it anymore. I didn't see that. I was hopeful now that I knew that I was doing the damage, it wasn't all these things that I had no control over.
Right.
Things that had happened in my life that had already happened. I had hope that even if I learned to hit myself 30% less, and with 30% less impact, the quality of my life would change. I had hope that I might have some insights, knowing that I was the cause, that there was a chance that I might be able to see how to stop doing what I was doing.
Absolutely.
But this man who'd been in the state hospital for 47 years said, and I don't have to do it anymore. And I don't know, that we would want to take the next 25 minutes, but he literally then for the next 25 minutes explained what had happened to him.
Yeah.
And how he got caught up in his thinking in a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And how he had done that to himself.
Yeah.
Wow.
I got goosebumps just hearing the story.
That was the first of many. It was the first of many, but I tell you, the one story there's two other stories I'd love to tell you, but because they make different points, if you're okay, but I'm fine with taking questions too.
I love the stories. There's so much to learn from them. So
shall I go ahead?
Love the stories. Keep it up.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
Well, after a year in my hometown, which was incredible, because I've got they had me they heard that miracles were happening out at the state hospital. It got around town, and I could tell you some of the other ones too. But the things started happening, and so they asked me to be on the radio. They asked me to. I was on a front page interview on the local newspaper, a town of 38,000, right?
Yeah.
One of the hospitals said, "Would you start? We'll give you $10,000 a month and pay for all of your administrative fees, and you get all the money that you collect. Would you give us 2 days a week if we set you up an office and give you administration?" This is I'm going, pardon me, and so I was consulting out of the hospital 2 or 3 days a week and 2.5 days, and I was doing private practice 2 days a week and doing consults at the hospitals, and miracles started happening. And then at the end of that year, I was supposed to, I had called because my wife had the same experience with her mother that I had with my father.
Yeah.
Where she would wait for a year to so excited to see her mother, and within 2 hours was ready to leave, even though she didn't.
Right.
Because she didn't, her mother would tell her she was either too fat or too skinny, and her hair was too long or too short, and her dresses were too loud or too subtle, and she saw, I said, well, didn't she do the same thing? And she said, yes, but I saw her through eyes of love. I saw that she really felt like she was trying to better my life.
Right.
And I just felt loved. And I told her, listen, I will take to heart everything you said, Mom. I really will. Now, I just like you, I'm sure with your mother, I'll have to make my own decisions, but I am deeply grateful for the love that motivated you to let me know what you think is important to me.
Yeah.
She had the same experience, and she asked me, can we stay for a year? So that's how we stayed, because we were supposed to be in Coral Gables 10 days later.
Sure.
So we stayed for a year, and miracles happened, but they wanted, the city wanted me to stay, but I knew that I wanted to learn this more, and I wanted to, so we headed to Coral Gables, and I was there for a year. But I'll tell you at least two examples, because I learned from the first one how deeply ingrained we are in this pathology model, and that people have these serious mental illnesses, and we don't see that most physical illnesses and all mental illnesses are a lack of spiritual understanding of how you're connected to your psychological and your physical nature. So this 16-year-old young man was referred to me. Parents brought him in. He was on, this is 1983, he was on 800 milligrams of Thorazine. Now, you guys know, if either of us had 50 milligrams of Thorazine, we'd be lucky if we woke up 16 hours later, right?
Right.
He's on 800 milligrams of Thorazine, and he's threatening to kill his parents while they're sleeping. And he's periodically hallucinating and having command voices, etc. So so they said, this is your patient, obviously being a psychiatrist. So what I learned from this, I will tell you, is that I did not have the parents participate as well as I should have. And I learned from this, because here's what happened. So they came in and I had a little meeting with them, and then I met with the young man. And this is summary of the first, in about 2 minutes. But I said to him, I said, do you always hear voices? Are you always hearing these voices telling you? He said, no. I said, well, do you know, is it related to anything? He said, no, they just seem to come. I said, okay. Says, does your mother ever get upset about anything? She said, well, she does. Every once in a while, my father does or says something that she gets upset. I said, well, what happens? Well, she said, well, she gets kind of irritable. She doesn't sleep too well. And usually by the second day, she gets a terrible migraine headache. And she's in her so immobilized, she's in her room, with migraine, has to total darkness. And I said, really? She has all these medicines for migraine. I said, does your father ever get upset about anything? He said, well, yeah, he does occasionally. He watches television. This is 1983, right? He watches politics and he gets upset if the people are saying things that he doesn't believe in, and he gets upset. I said, well, what happens to him? He said, well, his stomach starts bothering him really bad. And he starts having taken Tegamet back then, probably, or something like that, and Pepsid and Tegamet, and he gets irritable and he doesn't sleep, and then his stomach really starts bothering him, and sometimes he even has to take a day off of work because it's right. I said, well, Joe, here's Jose. I said, Jose, I'm going to suggest to you that your voices and your thinking, muddled thinking, is your mom's migraine and your dad's stomach pain. It's trying to let you know that you've been given too much attention to some thoughts that have come into your head, some upsetting thoughts.
Wow.
Okay. So who knows? But that's what I kind of remember.
Yeah.
So he's on 800 of Thorazine. He's threatening to kill them at night. They're terrified. I said, I'm not going to raise your medicine. I brought him in at the end. I said, I'm not going to raise the medicine because I feel like, Jose, do you feel like you've heard something was helpful? He said, I do. I really like this doctor, Mom, Dad. I think I can trust him. So I said, I'm going to give you some 100 milligram tablets. And Jose, will you promise me that if your parents, they love you? Yeah, I do. If they say you need a 100 milligram tablet, extra one, will you promise me that you'll take it? And if in an hour, if you're still having trouble and they say, I think, Jose, you need another one, will you take it? And he said, yes. I said, contact me. I had a pager, I think. I said, you get me. Okay. Well, they come back in 2 weeks. Now, I can't believe that I made it 2 weeks rather than 1 week, but I did. And they said, doctor, we've got a problem. I said, well, what's that? They said, how many PRNs? Well, we haven't used any of the extra medicine at all. And you need to do something. I said, well, what's the problem? When he came in, he was sleeping about 4 hours a night.
Yeah.
Now he's sleeping 10 to 12 hours a night, and he's drowsy during the day. And he's having no hallucinations.
Wow.
I said, well, what do you think? A good doctor, right?
Yeah.
What do you think we should do here? Well, doctor, I think we need to lower his medication. I mean, it's not rocket science.
Right.
I said, okay, well, let's do that. Let's lower it down to 600 milligrams, but you have the hundreds.
Yeah.
So that if you need to go to 700, you can. To make a long story short, or not as an Irishman, not so quite so long. They come in the next time, same thing. He's heard something new. He's heard something again. They said, doctor, he's still sleeping. He fell asleep in church. He's fallen asleep in school. I said, well, we got to lower the medicines. I said, oh, okay. So we'll go down to 400.
Yeah.
Next time, 200, 2 weeks later.
Amazing.
Now, here's what happened. They don't come back. I'm puzzled. I call. Yeah. I finally call. I wait a couple of weeks. I call. She said, no, doctor, and we're not coming back either. We're going to somebody who understands schizophrenia. You obviously don't. you're trying to get our son off his medicines. And they warned us about people like you.
Wow.
We're taking him to somebody who understands schizophrenia. Wow. Wow. I wasn't lowering. He was having insights. His hours of activating the HPA axis were going from 14 to 10 to 6 to
right.
Now, he may have needed 35 milligrams. I'm making this up, but he may have needed 35 milligrams of Thorazine.
Right.
To make it through college, to make it through medical school, to get his PhD in physiology and go work at NIMH doing research on schizophrenia.
Right.
He may have.
He may have.
He may have.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Well, that's a wild story.
It's a wild story. And I said, pardon me, but I said, I understand schizophrenia, but I also understand mental well-being. And your son has he has a serious mental illness. I said, okay. I said, I tried to help. Yeah.
Even in illness, the capacity to heal themselves
because the spirit, if you're a spiritual being having a physical human experience, you can't, no gene can affect your spirit, your form, your divine, if we are divine energy in a form, if everything, as David Bohm even says, the quantum physicist, if there's a wholeness, he uses the implicate order and the explicate order. Sid says the formless and the form and the allness.
Yeah.
David Bohm says the implicate order, the explicate order, and the wholeness. Same freaking thing. One has a 9th grade education. The other guy is past now, but he's a quantum physicist who really understood that that if you didn't start dealing with the limitless, the infinite, you weren't going to solve the problem.
Absolutely.
Right. So I learned. So can I follow with one story because I learned from this?
Of course you can.
I learned this to bring in the family.
Yeah.
Because if they don't get a buy-in and have an understanding of what's happening, that I could see, I thought, oh gosh, I wish I would have known this. I would have made sure they were more a part of the process.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't get frightened and deal with their questions about, well, what if the doctor says this? He said, never, and explain. Well, if your son's getting healthier, right? He's accessing his mental well-being.
Right.
So when I was in the Navy, I was this Navy flight surgeon for a man. It doesn't matter what his name was. He became Commodore of all the anti-submarine helicopter squadrons, and which is Commodore is kind of between captain and admiral. It's an honorary thing, but and he retired, and he told me that I was in his 34 years in the Navy as a pilot, that I was the finest flight surgeon that he'd had out of 25. Which was an honor to say that, And so we stopped, my late wife and I stopped there on the way to Coral Gables. We went up to Massachusetts, and he said, Bill, are you really telling me that this is equivalent to Einstein's breakthrough in physics in 1905 papers? And I said, Frank, I really do. I think someday it may take time just like his did, but I think it's that big.
Right.
Okay, so I'm down there in fellowship, and I get this call from his cousin, who said, and the husband was on the line too, and they said, our daughter has been in the Massachusetts, I know I probably shouldn't mention, but an elite place in the Northeast,
sure,
for 4.5 years, and she's still on 4 She was at Dartmouth. She's very bright. She was at one of the Ivy League schools, and she's been incapacitated, unable to work or go to school for 4.5 years.
Wow.
And she's she's had moved up to Boston, and she was being seen daily during the week, and had been then periodically hospitalized. Was sent out to a hospital out here in Phoenix for 7 months one time, but they couldn't help either. She had a dislocated jaw one time for 3 days on Haldol from a dystonic reaction. They could have probably sued. They didn't because they thought she was faking. I can't imagine walking around with a dislocated jaw for 3 days.
No thanks.
So she comes. So they said, we know you can't help, but Frank, this man that I had been his flight surgeon, Frank said we had to talk to you, and so we know you can't help, but we're just talking, and we just called you. And I said, well, I'm not too sure that I can't. They said, pardon me. She's been 4.5 years, and I said, has it been helpful? They said, well, no. Well, I said, maybe I have penicillin. Or I have insulin.
Right.
Whatever your metaphor.
Yeah.
Maybe I've got something they don't have.
Absolutely.
You're serious. I said, yeah, I'm serious. I said, can I talk to your daughter? I talked to her. We laughed. I said, I think I can help. They said, why? I said, she laughed at my jokes. That's my criteria. No, I said, no. But we had a nice talk. I said, I think I can. I'm asking for 2 weeks. They said, how about 1 week? I said, what you're trying to accomplish in 2 weeks? What hasn't been accomplished in 4.5 years? Yeah. They gave me 8.5 days. They came in on a Tuesday evening.
Wow.
She sat in my waiting room. I was renting part-time from a surgeon that was kind of retiring, and I was renting from him. And she sat like a frightened animal, shaking. She would not even come into the office, even with her mother. She wouldn't come into the office. I had to see her in the waiting room. She was shaking. She couldn't even talk. She was like this. Her mother said, well, anyway, she hadn't been able to work or go to school. I'll cut to the chase. After 3.5 days, I saw her mother on Monday morning, and I actually had asked this young woman, we'll call her, Julie. I mean, I'll probably slip and call her a real name, but Julie. And I said, would you talk to one of my female teachers at the institute I was at? And is it okay to go to breakfast with your mother? I said, because I'm not going to be talking about anything, but we had not even talked about her problem because I figured she had gone over her problems enough times.
Yeah.
That wasn't working. So I went to breakfast at Jerry's All World Restaurant. If you're ever in Coral Gables, it's a little grandiose, but Jerry's All World Restaurant. I don't know if it's still there. And I said, how's your daughter doing? And tears started coming down her face. And this is after 3.5 days. She said, Dr. Pettit, there's a miracle happening, and I don't know what's going on. What do you mean? She said, well, she would put on makeup, and we went out to eat at a restaurant for the first time in 4.5 years last night.
Amazing.
She had a friend whose mother had died 10 days ago that she's been asking me to write a letter. And last night she wrote a beautiful 3-page letter to her friend.
Wow.
To her friend. And I think she's on her second novel, she said.
That's amazing.
On Tuesday, I'd see her in the morning. I'd see her for 5 minutes, and then her mother in the afternoon, because I'd learned.
Yeah.
I'd see them together, both of them, because I'm teaching them how the spiritual nature connects to the psychological and physical nature. And so, there was no books, there was no videotapes in 1983. I was just winging it from what I'd seen. And I said, "Where's your mom?" She said on Tuesday afternoon. Her mother was. She said, "My dad flew in." I can't imagine that phone call. Get your ass down here. I don't know. I don't think he's feeding her drugs. I don't know what's going on. Just come down. And so I had Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning with all 3 of them. Within 6 weeks, she was off all medications.
Wow. What a remarkable
After
story.
4.5 years, she went then to one of the Massachusetts colleges. She got a job within 3 weeks as a lifeguard. She had been a lifeguard 5 years ago as a 19-year-old.
Yeah.
She went back to college. She graduated with a 4.0 grade point average and majoring in mathematics.
Unbelievable.
She went to New York University in downtown New York.
Wow.
And got her master's degree in physical therapy and became a physical therapist, married a physician who was resident at the hospital. They had 4 beautiful children.
Wow. What an amazing stories just to
And
demonstrate.
in my witnessing, I'm going to be telling, 4 or 5, 6 from each place of the biggest ones.
Stories like that.
Stories. People
about-
that came out of their manic. One man in Bradenton, Florida, had been manicky for 3 weeks when he came in. He'd been up for 46 hours. He was on massive amounts of medications. Yeah. And I hesitate to tell this because it sounds like a technique. I didn't know what to say, but I got tickled. I came in, he'd been awake for 40 some hours. Through the night, he got admitted on a Sunday I was on. I come in Monday morning, and they'd been bringing magazines from all over the hospital, 400-bed hospital. They'd been giving him magazine so that he was sitting in a chair and he had magazines up over his knees.
Wow.
Torn up because he'd been tearing them all night. That's the only way he could deal with all the energy.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know what to say, but something came out of my mouth. I said, Joe, it looks like you've been really doing some heavy reading. Well, right. He got tickled and laughed.
Yeah.
He came out of his manic psychosis.
Yeah.
In that second.
Yeah.
And we ended up talking like we've been talking.
That's amazing.
And the nurse, we walked out of there, and the nurse who had been there for 28 years said, "What the hell happened in there?" And she was a little bulldog. We all know them, and they're priceless because they keep things under control, and they save our ass a number of times, right?
Right.
But I said, well, her name was Grace. This is 42 years later. I said, Grace, I think he came out of his mania. She said, that's impossible. I've been doing this 28 years. That's impossible. I said, well, our last 10-minute conversation, his and me together, was at a much better quality of conversation than the one you and I are having right now. So then I said that I was going to stop his medication. I was going to stop his Haldol. She made the mistake of saying, you can't do that. I said, well, okay, wait a minute. Grace, I think that MD behind my name the power to start and stop medicines as I see. Now, I'm going to give an as-needed medicine, but I only want it given if he needs it.
Right.
Not if you or the nurse needs it.
Yeah. Just how deeply influenced our physical and mental well-being are all around our thoughts. Just deeply connect,
So I can wrap this up in about 5 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, can I give you that? Because the ending has came out. I'd had that experience, but he was fine and he didn't require any more medicine. One nurse that night gave him 5 milligrams of Haldol, and I looked for any documentation of why. There was no behavior, there was nothing. And so I had a nice talk with her. I said, this is going to stop. I went to the supervisor. I said, if you have something that you document that he needs it, otherwise no medication. So the Wednesday night, his daughter was there. I was back doing a consult, and she said, Doctor, my dad wants to go home. And I said, well, how's he doing? She said, I've talked with him for 2.5 hours today. He's in the best state of mind that I've ever seen in my life. Okay.
Wow.
Now, he told me later, we think of mania as a terrible thing. His last thoughts were, and I've asked a lot of people that became hypomanic and manic, what was the last thoughts that you had? And many of them don't remember, but about 75% do. And every one of them that do said, the last thing I remember was that suicide had become a genuine option.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in fact, with this man, he was so depressed. He loved his wife and his 9 and 11-year-old boys. He had thoughts of killing his wife and his 2 boys out of love, and then himself, because he didn't want them to live in this hell called life.
Wow.
So that mania, we don't realize that that's a love letter. These symptoms are trying to summon us to the present, to the stillness of now, where we can hear the divine wisdom within us.
Right.
That mania saved 4 people's lives, and I can tell you a number of stories where that had happened.
Wow.
That saved 4 people's lives.
That's
I discharged him that Wednesday evening. I had made an appointment for Friday. Can I just tell you what happened on Friday when he came in?
absolutely.
So he comes in. He looks wonderful. His wife looks like shit. Okay. I know what's going on, but I don't. I said, Joe, how you doing? He said, Doc, I'm feeling wonderful. He said, I'm sleeping like a baby about 8 hours a night. I'm not taking anything to sleep. I just fall asleep. I said, well, do you still have some of those insecure thoughts about your finances, because your wife had lost a job and you're working? Yeah. No, he said, he said, I was just so involved in thinking about the problem that I couldn't see the solution. But now we're going to be fine financially. I've seen at least 2 things. We're going to be fine. And I said, well, do you ever have any of those thoughts at night, those insecure thoughts? He said, yeah, I do. I said, well, what do you do with them? He said, well, I count them. Hell, they're as good as sheep. And then I fall asleep. Not shit. That's what he said.
That's what he said.
And then I fall asleep.
You're right.
So I look over at his wife, and she looks terrible. And this is Friday afternoon at 3. He said, I haven't slept since he came home Wednesday night. And I said, well, Betty, I said, what's that about? She said, well, I've been worrying about Joe. I said, well, what are you worrying about? She said, well, all my friends is kind of like to that what that woman with the schizophrenia. All my friends told me that that's impossible.
Right.
It must be a flight into health. He can't have gotten over his mania that quickly, and he's going to get sick again.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, Betty, what would you be doing if Joe was still in the hospital? She said, well, I'd probably be worrying that he hadn't gotten well fast enough.
Right.
And I got tickled just like you. I started laughing, and she got really pissed.
I bet.
And she said, Doctor, I love my husband. And I said, Betty, I know you love your husband, but I'm going to suggest to you that worry has 0.0 to do with love. She said, how can you say that? I said, well, I'd be against worry if it didn't accomplish so much. She said, well, that's right. It doesn't accomplish anything. I said, even if it didn't accomplish anything, I might be for it.
Yeah.
But it does. What does it do to your mood when you worry? Does it get better, more lighthearted and joyful? No, it goes down. What happens to your level of calm? Do you get more anxiety and more tension? What happens to your level of thinking? Does it get clearer, or do you get more muddled?
Yeah.
What happens to your sleep? What happens to your pain tolerance?
Right.
I said, you're telling me that has anything to do with love? It has to do with insecurity. She said, well, what's love to you? And I said, love to me is living in a loving, lighthearted state of mind, and having that available to my family, to the clerk at the grocery store, to the people I work with. I'm not saying I do that perfectly, but that's what it is. That's my goal.
Right.
That's my goal. That's what love is to me. Well, I saw him for about three individuals, and they came to a group for 8 sessions. They were fine. He never, he was fine. And I could tell you stories for 24 hours like that. And that's what I'm going to be doing in this course, Witnessing Miracles. I'm going to go every place I was, some of the challenges and some of the things that happened that just blew me away. And I'll tell you what happened. Everywhere I went, there would be a couple of nurses that would see, why God, this doesn't happen to, there's something special here.
Yeah.
And so they trusted me,
Yeah. So if people wanted to participate in that, where would they go to do that?
Where would they do what? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How would they go to sign up for your legacy course? How would they get involved in learning more about that?
Yeah, I've got 6 online courses that are really, but the 2 legacy courses, one is June 3rd through the 6th and 10th through the 13th. It's going to be live, and that's 8 days is a lot. It's live streamed and it's in person. And then the other one is going to be start in July, and it's going to be the first 2 hours from noon Mountain Standard Time, or Pacific Daylight Time right now, but Mountain Standard Time, noon to 2, the first 3 Wednesdays of each month for 9 months. It's going to be 54 hours.
Wow.
And we're going to go completely through the DSM-5 and the ICD-10, every major category. And I'm going to tell stories of hope.
Wow.
There's a bunch of them on my website that a lady from UK did some interviews, and they're called Stories of Hope. But wow. I'm going to, from each of the places, I'm going to tell story. I'm going to, as we go through the ICD-11 and the DSM-5, I'm going to go through every symptom and show that the symptoms are beneficent alarms summoning us to the silence, to the stillness of now.
Wow.
If you turn down a one-way street, you want to see the big red sign that says you're going the wrong way so you can get your ass turned around quickly. You don't want to wait till you have 30 cars and trucks coming at you at 65 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And
what's your website?
Bill, it's Dr. Bill Pettit, www.drbillpettit.com. drbillpettit.com.
What I'm going to ask one more question that maybe we can summarize this.
Oh, and I can answer you. I'm glad to answer. You can ask many. I've jabbered. Yeah.
No, you're good. I just want to make sure that, from a mind, consciousness, thought, all of the principles, in your legacy courses, if someone, just a listener, why does this matter so much to medicine? Why, in your own words, how would you summarize that for the listeners?
If I first of all, these gifts of mind, thought, and consciousness are a metaphor for the divine, but they're also been gifted to us. We could not be having this conversation to go through life if we didn't have the power to think and we weren't conscious of what we were creating, right?
Absolutely.
Somebody said one time, why don't you say this is a theory? Because it's not, it's you can't make a theory without a mind, without the ability to think, and without being conscious.
Yeah.
It's the building block of every theory that's ever been created, was created from the use of mind, thought, and consciousness. And every human being on earth, Corey, is using this to create their experience. And if we don't know when to leave our analytical thinking alone, I didn't know that there was a river of wisdom within the consciousness of every human being. And in fact, I would call it a river of love and wisdom. Absolutely. And they cohabitate. Sid would say they're 2 words for the same thing. Yeah. Wisdom always comes with from a loving feeling. It's never disruptive. Never. And if we don't know when to leave our analytical thinking alone and go to stillness so we can listen within, I didn't know it for 41 years, despite 26 and a half years of education.
Yeah.
We all know doctors who have taken their lives, they've hung themselves or killed themselves because they were in such pain and they didn't know how to get back home to that place of peace.
Yeah.
So to make it really simple, if you want to think of it, we're activating. There's one study that showed, and again, these are arbitrary, that the HPA axis is meant to be activated, the stress response, up to 30 minutes every 24 hours. That's what it's meant to be activated. Yeah. And if you can do that, you're going to live at ease. You're gonna have a high level of resilience. You're going to go through the losses. You're going to face even the ultimate death. You're not going to be afraid
Yeah.
if you identify with the spirit and you understand that's available. If you go from 30 minutes to 3 hours, you're going to move from ease to dis-ease.
Mm.
You're going to start having alarms. Your mood's
Yeah.
some people, it's going to be more their mood. Some people, it's going to be more their anxiety. Some people, it's going to be more physical. Some people, it's going to be their thinking. Everybody's has different alarms that will be louder than the others.
Sure.
But if you go over 3 hours a day for any length of time, you're going to move from dis-ease to disease.
Wow.
Mental, psychological, or physical disease.
Yeah.
And I can make the clear statement that if you get spiritual healing from spiritual conscious, 100% of the time, I don't care what you've experienced. Viktor Frankl knew this. 100% of the time, if you have spiritual healing, you will have psychological healing. And frequently, you will have physical healing.
Wow.
I have had so many people whose chronic pain went away the day they forgave somebody for something that did 26 years ago or 19 years ago, that they'd held, and they wondered where their pain that they'd been all over the country, their headache or their stomach pain disappeared.
Wow.
I could tell you stories of chronic pain that this will revolutionize our health system.
I believe it.
Doctors will become true health providers than illness providers.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing all the wonderful stories. There's just so much wisdom in learning everything that you have to share. Jeff, what are your reflections? What do you have?
Wow, just a lot of brilliance, and going back to the stories, like the rebuilding of your relationship with your dad,
right,
based on who you were being.
Yes.
The schizophrenic patient who saw something that you hadn't even yet seen.
Yes.
That wasn't a doing, because you didn't even have conscious access to it in the moment. It was who you're being.
Right.
So this is very consistent with how you show up and who you're being, coming from this place of love and understanding. It makes a difference for people.
Yeah, and that's really a good thing to point out, Jeff. You know, my 10 hours with Steve Hardison at 81 years of age catapulted me into action in a way with clarity of what Sid, I saw clearer, with more clarity, what Sid was pointing to, and I saw the ability to move to action that I had slowed down at, and not that I've never been passive, but it's taken me to a whole new level. And so I want to acknowledge that too. You know, my talk at the Being Conference in Peru was, being who you want to be is a lot easier when you know what you are. If you know that you are truly divine energy in a form, creating your experience with these gifts of divine mind, thought, and consciousness, it's a lot easier. I see some people, God love them, some deeply spiritual people, but I see some other people, understandably, in both the Being community and the Three Principles community, who want to make this psychological, and they don't see the spirit. As you know, Sid said, these principles are not of this world, he said.
Yeah.
They're not of this world. And so, and you know, Steve Hardison is one of the most deeply spiritual human beings that I've ever met.
Right.
And but I see some people who are trying to be a certain way, but they don't understand. So they're still activating the stress response. They're still carrying a burden from the past. Right. And so I think both communities have something to give, to contribute to each other.
Absolutely.
And if, to me, we should walk, if we can't walk arm in arm, and I think we can, we should at least walk side by side. But I think if we can join arms, there's so many forces these days that are about revenge and negativity and hatred, that when we're talking about love and connection and kindness, we need to lock arms with anybody that's going that way, I think.
I agree with you 100%. That wonderful words to be spoken.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
want to acknowledge you, Dr. Pettit, for your service to others and just your sharing of all of your wisdom and knowledge and sharing the three principles. And acknowledge you for being on this with us and helping us and our listeners learn more about it, and so that we can build a bigger community of folks who are like-minded and moving in the same direction. So I just want to acknowledge you for all your work and all your service. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I'm a good teacher, part of it is because I learn so slowly. I tell people I may not be good, but I'm slow. But there's the advantage of learning slowly is I tell people, listen, it's incremental.
Yeah.
Just be grateful for. Sid used to say, if you are grateful for what you have seen and what you do have, that feeling of gratitude will carry you forward to see more 100% of the time.
Wow.
But if you get in judgment of I don't see as fast as Corey's seeing it, or Jeff is seeing it, or Bill, no, don't. It's not about comparisons,
right?
It's about everyone has their own journey, and it's about being grateful. And gratitude will always, Sid said, always 100. It will always. That's a big word.
Yes,
it will always carry you forward.
Wow.
If we can just remember that.
Yeah.
No one, even including ourselves, is deserving of our judgment, because it impedes our ability to love and to give and receive love. It does. It's just a fact. It's the way the system works. You say that's not fair. Well, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Give and receive love. That is what it's about.
When I start to have judgments of myself, oh God, I can't believe I did that. If I need to make amends, but then let the judgment go, because that's going to impede my ability. If I hold on to a judgment of myself or anyone, it's going to impede my ability to give and receive love.
Yeah.
And you have to decide what's important.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, what a beautiful way to wrap this up. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing everything that you did. Give and receive love. That's the message to move forward with.
Yeah, it's not rocket science, as they say, right?
Right. Well, simple, like we started this conversation with.
Yeah.
Your wife said it's simple, right?
Do you know Steve Chandler?
Yes.
Steve, I bet Steve would be on your. Have you had him on the podcast?
Not yet, but I talked to him just the other day, so I'm going to make that request.
He would say, "Love is a system too," you know.
Yes, it is.
Love is a system too. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill, for being on.
It's
just a joy and a pleasure to have you. And our listeners definitely learned so much gold in everything that you said and spoken today. So thank you for being on.
Think of ways that we can work together. Please give me a chance. Give me a call.
Will do. All right. Well, we'll be in touch and let everyone reach out to you and learn some more. So thank you, Bill.
Thanks for your patience with my incompetence computer-wise.
Thank you for joining us today on the Being in Medicine show, where each week we open the transformative power of connecting our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual nature to how we show up in medicine.
If you find this conversation valuable, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you or someone you know has a story to share, contact us at beinginmedicine.com. See you next time.